Coming up on this week's Redcast.
But now technology is the business. In some sense, technology is existential to the operations of a modern financial institution. And that makes it an area of significant concern for regulators.
What really is happening to the industry is we're the most regulated industry in the world, and we're moving into an infrastructure that's unregulated.
And as of the end of this year, UK firms and European firms are required to understand what the climate risks are within their risk framework. That's not just about the risks arising from what they finance, it's also from their operations as well. And they have to determine whether that's a cross-cutting risk, so it's embedded in the other risk types, or it's a principal risk which they need to treat as a separate risk, similar to the way they treat operational risk, market risk, and credit risk.
So much moving all at once, you're going to need your supply chain to help figure this out. No one's going to figure it out on their own at any one bank, no matter how big you are, even if you're spending 100 billion. So we're going to need the big firms to get involved and really help drive this, and I'm really looking forward to seeing who steps up.
Welcome to Redcast.
Redcast.
Welcome, everybody. I'm PJ DiGiamarino, CEO and founder of JWG, and I'm really pleased to bring you another Redcast, this time focused on the cloud and digital integrity. For 18 months, we've been looking at all the various themes post-pandemic and how it fits with the regulatory agenda. And one of these biggest themes we've seen is the way that non-financial risk is now front and center for the entire sector. The problem is there's a giant technology blind spot. And I think we've known about this for a while, but it's been lurking off balance sheet. And really the thing that the regulatory agenda is shifting towards is trying to figure out how to withstand disruption. So going to your cash machine and not getting cash isn't fun. Trying to log on to WhatsApp and finding it's down really affects businesses now. So this systemic view of the supply chain is now really under a spotlight. And that's what we want to talk about here with this great panel that we've assembled in advance of our conference next week. In a nutshell, this has just got a lot more complicated. And I'd like to ask the panelists to explain a bit in their words what it is all about and what needs to happen in order to get controls back under control. So without further ado, I'd like to start with introductions. Brian, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, all. I'm Brian. Brian Yeoh. I'm from the FinTech group in the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of the Abu Dhabi Global Market, which is one very long string, but basically my title is to be Head of Data Governance and Strategy. Practically what that means is I look at technology risk and how to build appropriate guidance for regulatory financial institutions to manage this technology and data risk.
And before that, you were also at another regulator.
Absolutely. Thanks for apologies for that. So before joining the FSRA, I was in the Smart Nation and Digital Government Office in Singapore, working on the government data architecture there. And prior to that, I spent about 10 years at the Monetary Authority of Singapore, both as a regulator and working on data architecture and data analysis. So it's nice to be here. It's nice to catch up with PJ again after that time in MES.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to have a fellow poacher who's turned gamekeeper and moved to multiple places to be gamekeeper. Mike Zehetmayr, can you please introduce your role?
Thanks, PJ, and delighted to be here. So I lead our technology and data response to ESG at EY in financial services. My background is largely in cap markets and commercial banking from a risk reg and compliance perspective, though a very long time ago, I was trained as a glaciologist and physical geographer. So I have an ongoing interest over the last 30 years around climate change and ESG. The particular area of interest that I have is that obviously with COP26 coming to an end today, well, we hope today, I am very interested in how both policymakers and financial services are responding to the threats and risks from climate change, but more broadly around how ESG will become critical to financial services in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thanks so much. Richard.
Hi, I'm Richard Harmon. I'm based in London. I'm the global head of financial services at Red Hat. We're a very large, actually the world's largest open source provider of technology. Most of you remember the Linux platform. That was the original foundation for Red Hat. And in my background, I've got 30 years experience in financial services, mostly in capital markets, particularly in risk and advanced analytics. And I've actually the last 4 or 5 years really been looking at things like cloud concentration risk and obviously understanding the regulatory implications, but also how do you actually potentially even model the systemic risks that those contribute, which is the concern for regulators. Anyway, so I'm super excited to be on this distinguished panel, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, and it's going to be a heck of a discussion. I guess I've crammed a lot into this one. Brian, I'd like to start with you just to frame this for us. How has the regulators' approach to technology and data control changed, and how will it change more?
Sure, thanks. That's a great question. I think as a bit of a backdrop, the one thing that sums it up is that regulators care about technology now. Technology used to be something that was left in the back office, that happened as part of the operations of the business. But now technology is the business. In some sense, technology is existential to the operations of a modern financial institution. And that makes it an area of significant concern for regulators, right? So that's the backdrop to where we are. That's why regulators are now paying a lot more attention to technology risk. I think there are a couple of developments in this that have driven this concern. I think first is as I think Richard alluded to, the increasing reliance on outsourcing technology competency to other firms. The risks of relying on a firm that is not a regulated institution, but that is crucial to the operations of your system, I think is something that regulators are very concerned about. This didn't used to be, in the past, what regulators used to do is simply ban this. But practically speaking, in the modern world, that's simply not possible. The capabilities that outsourcing of technology capabilities bring is too great for regulators to step back.
And let's just drill in on it for a second, because outsourcing's been there, at least in Europe. And in 2007 for MiFID I, there was an outsourcing clause. But the main focus was it's the idiosyncratic view of risk. It's the firm that has to control how it's thinking about taking functions back over if something goes wrong. But the realization here is the supply chain is so deep and vast, you really can't take things back over. So this goes from idiosyncratic to a systemic risk. What does that really mean from a regulatory point of view?
So I think what it means is that the failure of one of these outsourcing, or one of your key partners in outsourcing, is existential to a firm. And that failure can come out of many sources, whether it's from the operations of the firm, whether it's from a cyber attack, whether it's from a data breach, whether it's simply a programming error that the firm has made that affects your internal systems. This means that regulators need to spend a lot more time trying to understand the business models, trying to understand the materiality of these, but also coming to the fact that you can't turn back the clock, that you have to live with this, and somehow you need to come to an accommodation. I think one of the key things that has helped in this journey for regulators is that we ourselves are forced to start taking up technology, and that's a simple reflection of the complexity and speed of modern financial institutions. The experience of working with such firms ourselves gives us a bit more of a flavor of what financial institutions might have to deal with.
Great. And I guess from a balance sheet perspective, this is all picked up as operational risk today.
Absolutely.
And then there is a linkage there. We just published a piece out of some research we did about how operational risk is intricately tied with what we're calling operational resilience. Can you talk a little bit about the regulatory approach to that?
So I think the regulators approach is to start taking a step back and realizing that all of these are intertwined. That it's not possible to separate technology risk from other types of non-technology operational risk, from your business risk, from your cybersecurity risk. All of these things come together. And as a regulator, I think one of the things that we think very carefully about is how to encourage a holistic approach by financial institutions on addressing such risk. It's no longer possible to just leave the cybersecurity to the CISO or the data security to the chief data officer. They need to talk to each other.
Yeah,
right.
Great.
And most importantly, they need to talk to the business. And the business can no longer simply say, this is stuff that the back end does. This is part of your business now.
That's so critical. And Richard, you referenced a number of discussions you've been having in your privileged position in the supply chain, because there's so much dependent upon your particular businesses. What is your perspective on the way people are picking up these new operational resilience and DORA, which is the European version of what's happening for operational resilience here in the UK?
Yeah, so I think if we just step back for a second, we look at what happened in 2008, the financial crisis. Brian and others who lived through that as a regulator, the focus really shifted to building integrity and resilience, right? And DORA, the Digital Operational Resiliency Act on the EU side, is sort of probably the most forward-looking at the moment. It's not a law, it's not a requirement yet, but it's under consideration. And it's really about building, obviously, resiliency in the technology stack. But the key tenet to it is around liability. And Brian hit this right on the nose. It's the firm's responsibility of their sort of their holistic view of their entire landscape around all the third parties they have. And I think that third-party accountability is a real challenge as we start to sort of move into more complex environments like cloud systems, and we're running things everywhere. And there's also the concerns around data and data privacy and data security. But we still have a lot of siloed data sets, and the cloud's not going to eliminate it. It's probably going to exasperate it to a certain extent, which is fine. But I think the impact of DORA is not just purely on the banking system. It also affects payment providers. It affects a lot of other institutions. And I think this goes exactly to this whole theme here, which is around resiliency, but also the control aspect of it and who's sort of responsible. But I think the challenge I think most people are going to be facing is sort of balancing the notion of, and this is even more so with the regulator, balancing the notion of risk versus being able to modernize their technology and capabilities, the back end with all the right security and agility and everything else. And that balancing act, and I think the regulators are doing a pretty good job at it, because they're taking a risk-adjusted view, not a risk-free view. Risk-free view means you don't do anything, in my view. And it's that balancing act of having oversight, the supervisory piece, which I know Brian was deeply involved in for several years, to be able to sort of manage and observe. But I think the key challenge for regulators and also for firms is this notion of transparency, of having this sort of single pane of glass view across the enterprise, what's going on. At the moment, I'm just talking about the firm's view, right? But the regulator also needs that view, and it's starting to try to do. So that's going to be, I think, a big challenge for the industry as a whole. And there was a CTO at one of the large global banks we were talking about this is about 3 years ago, and he said, what really is happening to the industry is we're the most regulated industry in the world, and we're moving into an infrastructure that's unregulated, which I thought was, he wouldn't let me quote him by name because he was afraid of losing his job. I'm just joking, but I think that's a sign of sort of the challenge we as an industry face, and that's sort of what Red Hat is also focused on in trying to enable sort of the right security levels and the agility and portability of applications, so you aren't locked in, and so there's also visibility on where you have things running, from a regulatory perspective.
Yeah, visibility and safety standards, right? So it gets back. It's back to making sure that we're all have common guidelines. Mike, I'd like to come to you on this one because obviously COP26, as you say, should be closing today. This is all just part of a much broader conversation across all industries right now. How do we get the right kind of transparency, and how do we put these safety controls in place?
So I think the really interesting thing here, which I think is sort of an emerging awareness amongst people, is that the speed at which a number of economic areas like the European Union and the UK are now adopting new disclosure standards around ESG, which are going to intersect with everything that Richard and Brian have talked about. So for those of you that aren't aware, as of beginning of next year in the European Union, financial institutions will now need to disclose their green asset ratio. A number of jurisdictions have also, like the UK and European Union, and now the US recently have committed or have mandated that there will be disclosures around carbon emissions, both from your own carbon emissions as an organization, but also your supply chain. So suddenly what we're going to have, as Brian was talking about within the supply chain, not only an understanding around what you have outsourced from a critical activity, but you now need to understand what you've also outsourced from a carbon emissions perspective and how that much contributes to your emissions as an organization. That, I think, is absolutely critical, because that is a set of standards that are mandated and are regulatory and consistent across the globe, so that you have jurisdictions like Malaysia, China, who are also, New Zealand, who are also adopting. I think at the last count, off the top of my head, there were 60 jurisdictions have now mandated TCFD reporting in the near term. So that level of disclosures is going to be critical, but also it's going to require people to be capable of quantifying and also understanding the level of emissions from the carbon from our activities. That includes both corporate services as well as financed emissions. So by financed emissions, it's the carbon that's being emitted from financial services funding or investments through their clients, as well as the emissions from the corporate service activity, so whether that's buildings or technology as well. So if you take, for example, Red Hat, IBM, IBM will both be a client or financial services organizations as well as a supplier. So there's an interesting question there, which is, how do you get consistency around that data and how that data is being used around the emissions associated with those activities, both the finance ones and those ones which you receive as a supplier? There needs to be consistency around that and understanding. That brings me on to the second point, which is there is multiple users of that data across the organization. I think, Brian, you made the point, which is we need the front office to recognize technology as a critical part of our activities. We also need to get to ensure that across the organization, that connective thinking across the front office, finance, risk, corporate services, around how that data is going to be used. And that is only just starting to emerge. And then the final point for people to think about is that this is a new data domain. So if I go and talk to a risk officer, a credit risk officer, around transition risk for an organization that they work with, whether that's with their supplier or their client, a credit officer will go, okay, I sort of get that. That's a new type of risk. Now, if I come to them and say, right, okay, now I need you to assess the physical risks and the physical risks arising and the vulnerabilities of your supply chain from a physical risk perspective, that is a new type of question. And as of the end of this year, UK firms and European firms are required to understand what the climate risks are within their risk framework. That's not just about the risks arising from what they finance, it's also from their operations as well. And they have to determine whether that's a cross-cutting risk, so it's embedded in the other risk types, or it's a principal risk, which they need to treat as a separate risk, similar to the way they treat operational risk, market risk, and credit risk.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is going to materially start shaping the way that people look at how do they manage those risks, not just the operational risks around the execution of the business, but the risks that are arising from the impact around climate change. And it doesn't just stop with climate change. So if you look at somewhere like the European Union, they are expanding the scope of that to include biodiversity, forestry, water, and the impacts around that, and also to social over the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, it strikes me as we're about 10 years behind on the standards agenda for all that.
Yes, PJ.
And I've had some of the other panel conversations go a similar way. And then, here in the UK, we've got the PRA writing letters, dear CEO, you need to get your regulatory reporting right because it needs to be the same standard as financial disclosures. Well, dear CEO, if you've got to get all that ESG stuff right, there are no standards for it today. We don't know what good looks like.
No, and I think the announcement last week around the creation by the IFRS Foundation of the International Sustainability Standards Board is absolutely critical to that. So if you look out in the world today, I think the last time I counted, there were 360 different reporting standards, both voluntary and mandatory. I think one for every day of the year is the way I look at it. Now, if you're a finance CFO or a business, you sort of go, how on earth am I supposed to navigate that? How am I supposed to get consistency? We are in that world today. We do not have the equivalent of US GAAP or IFRS for sustainability. There are standards out there like TCFD, but getting the comparability across those, but also the different taxonomies that are being announced in different jurisdictions, we do need comparability. That is emerging, but we are in a world of complexity that we will need to navigate in the short term.
Yeah. Let's talk about what we're expecting next week and what we like to hear most. I guess, Brian, let's come back to you. What will you be most interested in at our conference next week, and what are you looking to hear?
So I'm really interested in understanding how financial institutions, particularly in other jurisdictions or other areas, are really starting to come to grips with the issues of technology and how they are starting to adopt RegTech solutions that can help them address these. In the Middle East, I think one of the challenges that we face is the lack of, sufficient adoption of whether fintech or regtech. So learning from the experiences of other jurisdictions, I think, would be quite key. But also what I look forward to is talking about some of the work that we've been doing, particularly across all the UAE. The regulators have gotten together and issued a set of guidelines on how to use newer types of technology. I think that's one of the forward-looking parts of the region. I think the key thing about these guidelines is that they, I think, manage to capture the most expensive commodity in the world, which is senior management attention. Because when this type of focus is placed upon financial institutions, technology, operations, senior management needs to first pay attention and second start to own it and start to understand what impact this has on the business. So I'm looking forward to discussing a bit more about what we're doing there, and look forward to chatting with the other panelists.
Thanks so much, Brian. Really appreciate you joining this year. Richard, what about you?
Actually, I think what Mike touched on is one of the things I'm particularly interested in to see from an industry perspective and financial services. What are we actually, how proper and aggressive are we going to be in terms of addressing some of those challenges? I think the other thing about and I think it's the biggest topic in the next 10 years, that all of us have to address individually and also as institutions. But this also gets back to a bit of my background, which is the focus on sort of complexity science and to solve these kinds of problems. It's not just a simple rule. It's not such, and so that's sort of what we're coming to the financial system is sort of as we move more and more mission critical things into the cloud, and we're trying to address things like ESG at the same time, is this sort of hyper connected financial system. And that's the piece that I want to sort of explore a little, but I'm also curious, as I listen to, other panelists and other groups, is to see, whether this resonates with people in the sense that they're on a journey of modernizing their whole core infrastructure, modernizing their analytics, moving more into real-time capabilities, and are they looking at the more systemic, wider horizontal picture, which is exactly what Brian and Mike had highlighted about, are you looking at all of the complexities that you're taking on in that picture? And I think we'd probably all say at the moment, no. But I think that would be something that I'm particularly interested in overall across the whole, the whole event. Where does that resonate? Does it resonate sufficiently? Or is this, a budding problem that's going to explode in our face, 5-10 years from now? So that's sort of my area of focus on the conference.
Thank you. Mike.
So two things from me that I'm interested to hear. One is absolutely to Richard's point, which is we live in a world of complexity, and we live in a world of networks. And that's not just at a technology level, but that's, as Richard's highlighted, within a interconnected financial markets and financial services system. So what I'm interested in understanding is how do we collaborate and how do we work together across that network, because we are not islands that can stand alone, particularly, and I see that within an ESG perspective. We are reliant on that network, and that network needs to be able to respond together to be able to address the challenges that we see. I think the second point I'm interested in, which is, yes, society is waking up, and it's not just society in the Northern Hemisphere, the Southern Hemisphere as well. But I think that the level of urgency is still something that is, people still need to understand that we are starting to see changes that are impacting our operation, our businesses today. And therefore, getting that onto people's agenda, but also getting it embedded into the way that an organization, senior management think and respond and factor that into business decisions, I think is one of the things that I'm interested to see come out of the panel.
Thank you. I think you're spot on there, Mike. And I guess my own hopes for this particular session is that we really embrace the need for that collaboration. It's not just going to be private sector. It's got to be public sector as well, because these safety standards and guidelines just won't happen on their own, and certainly not under the time pressure that we're looking for. And then I guess one of the challenges in this whole space, having done an operational job, managing a procurement organization that spent €1 billion, it's just there's so much moving all at once. You're going to need your supply chain to help figure this out. No one's going to figure it out on their own at any one bank, no matter how big you are, even if you're spending $100 billion. So we're going to need the big firms to get involved and really help drive this. And I'm really looking forward to seeing who steps up. I mean, we're having a very difficult conversation for techies that like just focusing on their techie silos and looking at toys and shiny widgets. But this stuff now has real risk associated with it. And I think there's a bit of a manning up of the technical manager that's required. And I'm looking forward to seeing how that conversation evolves here at the conference, and then into the next couple of years, the RegTech agenda. So without further ado, thank you very, very much, gentlemen. It has been a pleasure to have this particular RegCast right before we kick off the conference. You'll get conference instructions, but it's regtechconference.co.uk. You can always follow along at regtechfs.com and subscribe to RegCast, because this is our 19th and there's plenty of back episodes to go back through by now. And we're looking forward to continue this going. So I'll sign off for now, and thank you all. Looking forward to speaking to you soon.
You can go to our conference website, which is regtechconference.co.uk, or go to the JWG website, which is jwg-it.eu. This is RegCast,
where we shine a light on banking digitization.